This is Classic FM.
Changing tack completely, really. As we speak, there are thousands of teenage girls outside in Leicester Square screaming their heads off in anticipation of One Direction turning up.
Oh, I thought it was because they knew I was coming to.
And you as well. Are you saddened that classical music doesn't quite generate that level of excitement amongst that age group, certainly?
Yes, that does sadden me. I mean, there was a time when it did, I suppose, not necessarily that age group, but certainly there were periods when, say, Franz Liszt would cause people to faint with his performances, and Chopin likewise. And great virtuoso performances could cause a kind of sort of weird effect. And you could get the reverse. You could get the riots, the so-called riot at the when the Ballet Russe first performed in Paris. Or when Façade was first performed, William Walton, people were throwing and booing and so on. But I think there are people, James Rhodes, the pianist, for example, performed an extraordinary programme at the Soho Theatre. It was absolutely packed, and he could have played it. He'd still be playing it now. He could be playing it for 30 weeks. I couldn't see anybody. I was way the oldest person there. You could hear a pin drop, and it was not a programme of Rondo à la Turque and popular pieces. The only very well known piece was the C-sharp prelude by Rachmaninoff, and otherwise it was Étude Tableau, and it was ballet. It was the third movement of the second piano sonata of Chopin, for example, not the Minute Waltz or anything like that. There were serious pieces of music, and he did that thing which I've always, as a boy, my father was a fine musician. He has in common with rather amusingly Alistair Cook, the England cricket captain, that they were both choristers at St Paul's Cathedral. Yes. And my father always loved music, so growing up in Norfolk, whenever there was a great pianist or Britten and Piers came to do a concert, we'd go over to the Suffolk and watch it, and there was a triennial festival. And I was always very puzzled. I remember Alfred Brendel coming and doing some magnificent Schubert and Beethoven, and it was as good as it gets. And he was, and he is. He's retired, but he's one of the greatest Schubert and Beethoven interpreters in history. And he came on. He gave a little curt bow, and then he sat at the stool and he played. And then at the end of the last movement of each piece, we all applauded, and he bowed. He played the next bit, and there was an interval, and so on. But not one word did he say to us. And James, he came and played the first piece, and then he got up, and then he told you what it was. And he told you when it was written, how old the composer was when he wrote it, what state of mind he was in, the fact he was a teenager when he wrote it. And he then played another piece by Rachmaninoff, which was the Étude Tableau, which was written 20 years later. And he didn't tell you how to listen to it. He didn't claim to have a single interpretation of it. But he said, the theme of this evening for me is about love, and I find this devastatingly sad. And he played bits of it. And then he played Widmund, the wonderful dedication that Schumann wrote to Clara, of one of many he wrote to her, but perhaps the most beautiful. It's a song, but fortunately it was also transcribed by Liszt beautifully. And again, he told the story of Clara and Robert Schumann, which is a desperately sad story. I mean, really appalling. Clara's parents didn't want Schumann to have anything to do with her. He wrote her three songs a week for a year. Can you imagine that? Every Monday, Wednesday and Friday, you got a new song by this man. Admittedly, he was Schumann and he was a genius, but she gave in anyway. They married, but of course he was a tortured soul. He was deeply, deeply bipolar, which you can tell from his letters. He had these crazy manic moods and these desperately sad moods, and died like Schubert in an insane asylum. And he tells that story. And I should also just big it up for anybody listening. We are few, but we are organised, as they say. It also happens to be the centenary of a much, much beloved piano composer by very few, called Charles Valentin Alcan, who rumour says died an almost comically sad death. He was Jewish, and he was climbing his library steps to reach down for a copy of the Talmud, and the entire bookcase collapsed on top of him and killed him. But I hope someone somewhere in the programming department of Classic FM will record Alcan, because he was a really magnificent composer.
Yes.
But I don't know how we wandered so far off the path. It's always lovely. We get me starting talking about music. But yes, James Rhodes is an example of someone who does really bring young people to it.
That's excellent.
By not making it a stuffy occasion.
Exactly.
I think you've got to take the stuffiness out of it. I absolutely agree. People can't rattle crisps and make a noise and talk and have their phone going off while someone else is closing their eyes and losing themselves in the music. But apart from that, I think performers have to learn to really learn to entertain and educate. And I think he's a really good example of that. He's not. Some of the snootier ends have said, he's the sort of Nigel Kennedy of pianists, which is a great compliment, because Nigel Kennedy was a magnificent violinist, and just because he had a slightly straight fetish, there's no reason whatsoever to be rude about him. And he did a huge amount to popularise Vivaldi, of course, but also other pieces. And I think James Rhodes will do the same he has quite a wide repertoire. I mean, he learns his extraordinary life story, which is just beyond belief. He didn't start learning the piano until he was 14, which is incredibly rare for a concert pianist, and didn't really get proper lessons till he was in his early 30s. But he is an extraordinary man, and I think people like him are the way forward. It's very difficult for the music publishing companies to know what to do. They want to find a beautiful young girl to sing soprano songs mixed in with a few songs from Broadway musicals, or they want to find a really hunky pianist who looks cute, or because they don't know how to sell the records. They just don't know how to do it. But Wigmore Hall and the Royal Festival Hall, they still sell out. And there is a huge appetite for music. The trouble is, you go to Wigmore Hall, and it's very, very rare not to see. It's very rare not to see some hair that is not white.
You're absolutely right.
That's the problem.
And you find yourself looking at the number of people who have sticks.
Yes, yeah, I know.
It does seem really quite an ancient audience.
And it's
not that there's anything wrong with that.
No, there isn't. But you want to take these composers out of their era and say don't associate them with powdered wigs and the patrons.
Yes.
Haydn's patron may have been Esterhazy for a long while, but Haydn was an extraordinary artist, very funny man. His notebooks when he came to Britain are hilarious. His observations on the British people are fantastic. We recently discovered his operas. I mean, they've suddenly become... and you realise how they were writing for us. Beethoven was writing on behalf of humanity. He was... And you allow him inside your head and you realise nobody can connect you more with your own personality, with the universe, with the terror of self-loathing, the hope of mankind being free. All the really big issues are present in the music of the great composers, or sometimes they're light and frothy, like the Champagne aria from Don Giovanni, but they're done with such delight. And just allow yourself to listen. I think there's a film called Running on Empty, directed by Sidney Lumet. I don't know if you know it, and it's the late lamented River Phoenix is a very, very talented pianist, but his family are on the run because they were anti-Vietnam War protesters who blew up a napalm factory, not knowing that there was a security guard there who they thought wasn't going to be there. So. They were on the lam for murder, and so they were constantly changing identities and you follow them as he changes. He dyes his hair blonde as he has to go to a new school. He arrives at the school. The first class he gets into is music, and the cool music master with whose daughter he then has an affair as it happens, puts on some Madonna. And they're all going, yeah, wow. And he then puts on some other music, it's a Beethoven quartet. And he says, what's the difference? And the sort of creepy one says, one's good and one's not good. And the music master said, well, it's a matter of opinion, surely. He says, "What about you, Mr. He looks down because he's the new student, Mr. Manfield. And he gives this brilliant answer. He says, "You can't dance to Beethoven." And although all music is somewhere way back, comes from dance, classical music, the changing of the accents and of the key signatures, and it's not dance music. It's not which all pop music is. It's there to be danced to. Classical music is there to be listened to, and you have to make that leap of closing your eyes, putting it on your headphones or whatever it is, and just letting it inside you. Yes, of course, you can twiddle away and whistle when you're driving as well, and that's delightful. But for your first real experience of music, to understand the profundity of a Beethoven concerto or quartet or Glenn Gould playing Bach, you have to listen, and when you do, you gasp. You gasp as you might when you're looking at the Duomo in Florence, or it's just simply beyond belief that mankind can achieve something, and that it's for you. He wasn't, a cathedral. You could say, well, it's an expression of Medici power. It's an expression of hoping to go to heaven. But with Beethoven, he's just reaching out and trying to say something to the heavens, to the cosmos, to the individual soul, and it's you. And it's, as it were, free. It's there to be loved and enjoyed, and that is true of Mozart, obviously true, but it's even true of an egotist like Wagner. If you take, I don't know, if you were to ask what Wagner music would you like me to leave the audience listening to? Well, there's so many. My little trick with people is to say, what's the most famous piece of Wagner music? And they all go, The Ride of the Valkyries, They think of that scene from Apocalypse Now, da-dun-da-da-dun. I said, no, that's not his most famous piece of music at all. They go, yes, it is. Well, what's more famous than that? And they go, da-dun-da-dun, da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-dee. And they forget that the Bridal March from Lohengrin is also by Wagner. But I wouldn't suggest that necessarily as the one to play. But if you were to think of a marvellous piece of play-out music of Wagner, the one I would suggest, because it can be played whole, is the one that turned me on to Wagner. And this is one of the great mysteries of life, isn't it? I was in the room with my brother. My father we didn't have television in his study, and we were having toast and tea or something. And he went to his record collection and he popped on something. And out came this piece of music. And my mouth immediately dropped open, or at least within about 4 minutes dropped open, and then it got more and more open as this extraordinary cascade of strings began to build up in a way that I'd never heard anything like it. And I said, what is that? My brother was listening and he thought it was perfectly charming. My brother then went on to collect, Pink Floyd and all the rest of it, as his generation did. And I immediately had to know who this composer was. And I, had to have everything he'd written, as it were, which unfortunately was a very expensive occupation, with box sets being the prices they were. And the piece of music was the Overture to Tannhäuser. And it shows you his extraordinary orchestral, the bravura quality of it. It's got this, of course, this marvellously trumpety major theme, but then what he does with the strings had never been heard before, and I think that's a really, really good piece to end on if one wanted to.
Well, that's fascinating, Stephen. Thank you so much for being my guest. It's been an engrossing few minutes. Thank you so much.
I've loved it too, Charlotte. Thank you very much.